When I hear the sound of a dial-up modem, it gives me panic attacks. That screeching digital screaming takes me right back to 1984, sitting in a converted warehouse in Sacramento, while Brother Marcus preached about the divine network that would soon connect all human souls. Most people think I'm weird for still using a flip phone and handwriting letters, but they don't understand what I lived through between the ages of 12 and 16. They don't know about the Data Covenant. My parents weren't crazy people, at least not at first. Dad was a computer programmer at IBM. Mom taught elementary school. We were normal middle-class suburbanites until Dad started attending these evening lectures at the community center. The speaker was this guy I'll call Marcus. He called himself Brother Marcus, and he claimed to be both a computer scientist and a biblical scholar. Said he discovered the true meaning of Genesis through studying early computer systems. Dad came home from that first meeting completely transformed, talking about how the human brain was just biological hardware waiting for the right software upgrade, how God's plan all along was for mankind to transcend flesh through technology. Mom was skeptical at first, but Brother Marcus had this way of explaining complex theological concepts through computer metaphors that made everything sound logical, inevitable even. Within 6 months, we'd sold our house and moved into the Covenant compound. It was this sprawling complex of converted warehouses on the outskirts of town. There were maybe 40 families total, all middle-class professionals who'd bought into Marcus's vision of digital salvation. There were engineers, teachers, accountants, even a few doctors, all smart people who should have known better. The compound was divided into living quarters, workshop spaces, and what Marcus called the processing center. That was a massive room filled with early personal computers, all connected through cables and phone lines. The constant hum of cooling fans and the glow of green phosphor monitors became the soundtrack of my teenage years. We weren't allowed to call it a church. Marcus insisted it was a research facility where we were developing the technology to upload human consciousness. School was held in the processing center every morning. We'd sit at computer terminals learning basic programming alongside Bible study. Marcus taught us that every line of code was a prayer, every algorithm a divine revelation. He claimed the binary system, ones and zeros, represented the fundamental duality of existence: divine and mortal, eternal and temporary, uploaded and unuploaded. The really twisted part was how he mixed legitimate computer science with his warped theology. We learned about data storage and retrieval while studying passages about eternal life. Memory allocation became lessons about the soul's capacity for grace. Input-output functions were explained as communication between the mortal and divine realms. Looking back, I realized Marcus was actually pretty brilliant. He understood technology well enough to create convincing religious metaphors around it. But the rituals were what really messed with our heads. Every evening after dinner, the entire community would gather in the processing center for what Marcus called synchronization. We'd all sit at terminals, hands on keyboards, while Marcus led us through these chanted prayers that incorporated programming commands. Our Father who art in mainframe, hallowed be thy code, followed by actual lines of computer code we type in unison. It sounds hokey now, but everyone there believed it in the moment. The sound was incredible and terrifying. 40 mechanical keyboards clacking in perfect rhythm, while we chanted about uploading our souls to God's eternal hard drive. Sometimes people would start crying or speaking in tongues, but their fingers never stopped typing. Marcus claimed we were literally programming our consciousness for eventual upload, creating spiritual backup files that would preserve our essence after bodily death. As I got older, the teachings became more extreme. Marcus started claiming he'd made contact with angel subroutines, divine programs that communicated through computer glitches and system errors. When someone's terminal crashed during synchronization, Marcus would interpret the error messages as prophetic visions. When the compound's main server overheated and died, he declared it a sign that the rapture was imminent. All the saved souls had been uploaded simultaneously, overwhelming God's processing capacity. The worst part was how isolated we became. We weren't allowed to watch regular TV or listen to radio. Marcus said external media would corrupt our spiritual programming with incompatible code. We couldn't maintain friendships outside the compound because unuploaded people might introduce viruses into our consciousness. Even family members who hadn't joined the covenant were considered potential threats to our spiritual data integrity. By 1987, when I was 15, things started getting really dark. Marcus began preaching about the need to optimize reproduction protocols within the community. Said that his consciousness contained the pure spiritual code, and that he needed to share his divine data with as many women as possible to ensure the survival of uploaded humanity. He started taking multiple wives, claiming it was God's will that he distribute his genetic and spiritual programming throughout the congregation. That's when my parents finally started questioning things. Mom was horrified when Marcus approached her about becoming his seventh wife, saying she'd been selected by the algorithm based on her compatibility scores. Dad had been having doubts anyway. He'd actually studied computer science professionally and was starting to realize that half of what Marcus taught was complete nonsense, wrapped in technical jargon. The breaking point came during a synchronization session, when Marcus announced that all unmarried women over 16 would be paired with optimal partners based on genetic and spiritual compatibility algorithms he'd supposedly developed. He was essentially arranging marriages for teenage girls, including several of my friends. When parents objected, Marcus accused them of trying to corrupt the upload process and threatened them with spiritual excommunication. My parents packed our belongings that night. We left at dawn while everyone else was in morning prayer, taking only what we could fit in our car. Marcus had always warned that anyone who left the covenant would be deleted from God's memory, doomed to spiritual extinction when their consciousness failed to upload at death. Despite everything I'd witnessed, part of me was terrified he might be right. Adjusting to the outside world was brutal. I'd spent my crucial teenage years in an isolated community where normal social interaction was considered spiritually dangerous. I didn't know how to talk to people without using Marcus's technical metaphors. I'd spent so many years thinking of my mind as software and my body as hardware that I'd lost touch with basic human emotions and instincts. The compound folded within 2 years of our departure. Turns out several other families had left around the same time, and without enough members to maintain the facilities and continue the research, the whole thing collapsed. Marcus tried to keep it going with the remaining believers, but by 1989 he was alone in that warehouse with his computers, still convinced he was on the verge of divine technological breakthrough. I heard from other survivors that Marcus was found dead in the processing center in 1990, apparently from a drug overdose. They said he'd been taking increasingly dangerous combinations of stimulants and hallucinogens, claiming they enhanced his ability to communicate with the angel subroutines. His final journal entries were mostly incomprehensible, pages of random code mixed with biblical verses and rambling theories about consciousness transfer. To this day, I can't use modern technology without feeling that old anxiety creep back in. Smartphones, social media, cloud computing. It all reminds me of Marcus's promises about uploaded consciousness and digital immortality. I know it's irrational, but Sometimes when I see people staring at their screens with that glazed expression, I wonder if maybe he was right about technology's power to fundamentally change human consciousness. I still have nightmares about those synchronization sessions, the sounds of keyboards, the glow of monitors, Marcus's voice promising eternal life through ones and zeros. Most people see technology as progress, liberation, and connection. All I see is another way for charismatic leaders to exploit people's deepest fears and desires. That's probably why I still write letters by hand and keep a landline phone. Call it trauma, call it paranoia. I call it remembering what happens when you let someone convince you that salvation comes through surrender to the machine. I met Jason at a coffee shop downtown in Portland. He was charming, well-dressed, and had this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. We clicked immediately. He was funny, seemed genuinely interested in my work as a graphic designer, and didn't give off any of those red flags you learn to watch for when you're dating in your late 20s. After 3 amazing dates, I thought I'd finally found someone normal. The first hint that something was off came about a month into our relationship. Jason started talking about these investment meetings he attended twice a week. Said they were helping him build his financial future, and that the people there had completely changed his perspective on success and wealth. He was vague about the details, but it sounded like some kind of multi-level marketing scheme. You know, those pyramid-shaped businesses where you recruit friends and family to sell overpriced products. I'd encountered MLM people before, and I learned to avoid them. But Jason wasn't pushy about it. He mentioned the meetings casually, said they were really helping him grow as a person, and left it at that. I figured it was his money to waste, and at least he wasn't trying to get me to buy essential oils or protein powder. That changed after we'd been dating for 2 months. Jason started suggesting I come to one of the meetings, just to see what it was about. Said the group was always looking for quality people, and that my marketing background would be valuable. I kept declining politely, but he was persistent in that gentle way that makes you feel like you're being unreasonable for saying no. Finally, I agreed to go to one meeting just to support him, and hopefully get him to drop the subject. The venue was a rented conference room at a mid-range hotel. Nothing fancy, but professional looking. There were maybe 30 people there, mostly couples in their 20s and 30s, all dressed business casual and chatting enthusiastically before the presentation started. The speaker was this polished guy named David, who talked about building your eternal portfolio and securing your position in the next phase of existence. It wasn't about selling products at all. It was about recruiting people into what he called spiritual advancement through hierarchical service. The whole thing was wrapped in vague religious language about the afterlife and earning your place in paradise. But the structure was pure MLM. Bring in people below you, move up in rank, gain more servants for eternity. I should have left right then, but Jason seemed so excited about it all, and David was a compelling speaker. He talked about how traditional religions got it wrong, that the afterlife wasn't about worship, but about service structures that you built during your earthly life. The more people you brought into the understanding, the higher your position would be when you died, and the more souls would serve you in paradise. After the meeting, Jason was practically glowing. He'd been attending for 6 months and was already a level 3 aspirant, which apparently meant he had recruited 5 people who had recruited at least 2 others. He talked about his downline, the people serving under him, and how proud he was of their progress. The way he described it, he'd have dozens of servants in the afterlife, maybe even multiple wives if he reached the higher levels. That should have been my wake-up call, but I was already emotionally invested in the relationship. Jason was sweet and attentive when we weren't talking about the group, and I kept thinking this was just a phase he'd grow out of. When he asked me to come to another meeting the following week, I said yes. The second meeting was when I started to understand how manipulative the whole system was. David talked about opening your mind to expanded relationship structures, and how traditional monogamy was a tool used by lower spiritual beings to keep people trapped in limited thinking. He explained that advanced souls understood the need to form spiritual bonds with multiple partners, all in service of building their eternal hierarchy. After the meeting, Jason started pressuring me to date other men and bring them into the group. Not because he wanted to break up, but because he wanted me to recruit them into my own downline while they served both of us. He called it strategic relationship building and said it would secure both our positions in the next life. When I resisted, he got frustrated and told me I wasn't being spiritually open to the possibilities. Looking back, I can see how they used textbook manipulation techniques. They love-bombed new recruits with attention and validation, created an us versus them mentality against unenlightened outsiders, and gradually introduced increasingly extreme concepts once you were emotionally committed. The meetings always ended with everyone holding hands in a circle, chanting about their eternal bonds in sacred service, which created this intense feeling of belonging that was hard to walk away from. I started dating 2 other guys, and after a while, I brought them to the group. Their names were Mark and Steve, not because I wanted to, but because the psychological pressure was overwhelming. Jason convinced me that if I really loved him, I'd help build our spiritual future together. The group reinforced this constantly, praising me for my courage to embrace expanded love, and telling me I was advancing rapidly through the levels. The whole situation was completely messed up, but I was trapped in what psychologists call trauma bonding, when you develop emotional attachments to people who are manipulating you through cycles of reward and punishment. Jason would be loving and supportive when I went along with the program, then cold and critical when I expressed doubts. The group provided intense validation when I followed their rules, then made me feel isolated and confused when I questioned anything. For 3 months, I lived this bizarre double life. During the day, I was a normal graphic designer with friends and hobbies. In the evenings, I attended meetings where people talked about their eternal servants and spiritual wives. And I maintained romantic relationships with 3 men simultaneously because I'd been convinced it was spiritually necessary. The breaking point came when David announced that it was time for our group to deepen our sacred bonds through physical unity. He started talking about group ceremonies, where couples would demonstrate their spiritual advancement through intimate acts witnessed by their downlines. Jason was incredibly excited about this development, saying it would accelerate our progress to the higher levels. That night, lying in bed next to Jason while he planned our participation in what was essentially organized sexual exploitation, I finally snapped out of the psychological fog I'd been living in. This wasn't about spirituality or the afterlife. It was about a charismatic leader using religious concepts to manipulate vulnerable people into increasingly degrading situations. I waited until Jason left for work the next morning, then packed everything I could fit in my car. I broke my lease, quit my job via email, and drove straight to my parents' house in Colorado without telling anyone where I was going. The only smart thing I'd done during the entire relationship was keep my family information private. Jason knew I was from Colorado, but had no idea where my parents lived, or even their last name. My last name is still my bio-dad's last name, and he died when I was 12. My mom changed her last name when she remarried. The cult because that's what it was, not some investment opportunity or spiritual group, tried to contact me constantly for weeks. Jason called and texted hundreds of times, alternating between angry demands that I return and tearful pleas about how much he missed me. Mark and Steve both reached out, saying the group was worried about my spiritual progress and that David wanted to personally counsel me through my dark period. I blocked all their numbers and eventually had to get a new phone. My parents were incredible. They never asked too many questions about why I'd suddenly moved home, just helped me find a therapist and start rebuilding my life. It took months of counseling to fully understand how I'd been psychologically manipulated and to stop blaming myself for getting trapped in such an obvious toxic situation. I still have nightmares sometimes about those meetings. The chanting, the talk of eternal servants, the way David's eyes would light up when he described the sexual ceremonies. I've done enough research since then to know that what I experienced was a textbook example of a modern sex cult, using MLM recruitment structures and New Age spiritual concepts to exploit vulnerable people. The scariest part is how normal it all seemed while I was in it. These weren't obviously crazy people. They were educated professionals with careers and families. But they'd all been gradually conditioned to accept increasingly extreme beliefs and behaviors through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. I never found out what happened to the group after I left. Sometimes I wonder if Jason is still there, still climbing their twisted hierarchy, still believing he's earning servants for the afterlife. I hope not, but I know how powerful that kind of indoctrination can be. I was lucky I got out when I did, before they could drag me even deeper into their sick version of paradise. I've been working the same 240 acres outside Hastings, Nebraska for 32 years. I inherited it from my dad, and I've never experienced anything like this before. Hell, I'm still not sure what it was. It started on a Tuesday night last August. I was sound asleep when this weird humming woke me up around 11 p.m. At first I thought it might be coyotes, but it was too rhythmic, almost musical. I lay there listening for a few minutes before I got up to check the windows. The cornfields looked normal, 8-foot stalks swaying in the breeze under a clear sky. But that sound kept drifting across the yard. I grabbed my flashlight and went out onto the porch, scanning the horizon for whatever might be making that noise. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped completely. Just the usual rustling of corn leaves and distant highway traffic. I figured maybe it was some kids messing around, or equipment from a neighboring farm, so I went back to bed. The next morning, I walked my usual perimeter check, looking for damage or signs of trespassers. Everything seemed fine. The corn was thick and healthy, almost ready for harvest. But something about that sound bothered me all day. It definitely came from somewhere in my fields, and not from the road. That evening around the same time, it happened again. Same rhythmic humming, but this time I was ready. I threw on my boots and grabbed my spotlight, the big one I use for checking cattle at night. Standing on the porch, I aimed the beam toward where the sound was coming from, somewhere deep in my northeast section. That's when I saw the lights, a soft, colored glow filtering up through the corn stalks, maybe a quarter mile from the house. Not harsh like headlights, but gentle blues and whites that seemed to pulse with the humming. And now I could make out what sounded like voices underneath it all. I stood there for nearly an hour, watching those lights shift and listening to sounds I couldn't identify, until everything went quiet again around midnight. I barely slept that night. I've lived on this land my entire adult life. I know every acre like the back of my hand. This wasn't normal. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The pattern repeated over the next few nights, always between 11 p.m. and midnight, always in the same general area. I started keeping notes, exact times, how long it lasted, and what the weather was like. The lights appeared 4 more times that week, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for almost an hour. By Sunday night, I had had enough of just watching from the porch. When that familiar glow started filtering through the stalks around 11:15, I made my decision. With a heavy flashlight in hand and work boots laced tight, I headed out into the field to see what the hell was going on. Walking through a cornfield at night is like being in a maze. The stalks tower over you, creating identical pathways that all look the same in the darkness. I had to stop constantly to get my bearings, using that distant glow as my guide. As I got closer, the humming grew louder and more complex. What I'd thought was just rhythmic noise was actually layered human voices. The women were singing in these beautiful harmonies that rose and fell in patterns I'd never heard before. The men were chanting something in a language I couldn't identify, though it didn't sound like Spanish or any European language I recognized. The combination was hypnotic and unsettling, echoing strangely through the tall corn. When I was maybe 50 feet away, I could see the light was coming from ground level, not from above like I'd assumed. I crept closer, trying to move quietly through the rustling stalks. The singing and chanting grew more intense, more urgent. Finally, I pushed through a row of corn and stepped into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. The corn had been folded down perfectly flat in a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across. Not cut or broken, but folded, like someone had carefully bent each stalk at the base without damaging it. In the center of the circle were these LED light strips arranged in geometric patterns I'd never seen before, powered by what looked like car batteries hidden in the corn. And there was a statue, about 3 feet tall, made of what looked like dark metal or stone, depicting a figure I couldn't identify. Not Christian, and not any religious symbol I recognized. It had multiple arms or appendages reaching upward, and symbols carved into its base that meant nothing to me. The moment I stepped into the clearing, the singing stopped. I heard people running. There were footsteps crashing through the corn in different directions. I spun around with my flashlight, trying to catch sight of whoever was fleeing, but the corn was too thick and they were too fast. Within seconds, all I could hear was my own breathing and the normal sounds of the night. I stood there for probably 20 minutes, examining the scene. The LED lights were still on, casting those strange blue and white patterns across the flattened corn. The statue felt cold to the touch and was heavier than it looked. Definitely not something someone could carry easily. But there was no sign of who had been there or how they'd gotten the equipment into my field without me noticing. I left everything exactly as I found it and went back to the house. I didn't sleep at all that night, kept expecting to hear the sounds again. The next morning I went back to the circle in daylight. The LED lights had been removed, but the statue was still there, and the corn remained perfectly folded in that geometric pattern. I took photos with my phone, though they didn't really capture how precise it all looked. About a week later, I found something else. Walking through a different section of the field, I came across a white garment hanging from a corn stalk. It looked like a robe or ceremonial dress, made of some kind of lightweight fabric, completely white except for a symbol embroidered on the left chest, the same kind of geometric design I'd seen around the statue. But I still couldn't identify what it was supposed to represent. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't heard the sounds or seen the lights since that night I found the clearing. The statue disappeared sometime during the following week. I went back to check on it, and it was gone. No trace that it had ever been there except for the still flattened corn. but I've been hearing rumors around town. Other farmers in the county have been mentioning strange things. Lights in their fields, unusual sounds at night, small crop circles that appear overnight. Nobody wants to talk about it directly, but word gets around in a small farming community. Something's been happening on multiple properties, and so far nobody's been caught or identified. I still have that white robe hanging in my barn. Can't bring myself to throw it away, but I don't know what to do with it either. I'm thinking I should turn it over to the local sheriff, in case they finally catch whoever's been doing this. All I know is that I check my fields more carefully now, especially at night. Look, I know this sounds completely insane, but I need to tell someone about what happened to my buddy Mike last year. I've changed his name to protect him, but he wants me to tell the story so others know, and it's still too fresh for him to say it himself. I mean, the guy's been through hell. Lost his wife in the divorce, got laid off from his accounting job, and the whole 9 yards. He was barely keeping it together, living in this tiny studio apartment, surviving on ramen and whatever odd jobs he could find. So when Mike saw this ad online, something about wanting more out of life and easy money for participating in sociology experiments, I guess desperation kicked in. The email exchanges seemed legit enough. They said they were researchers studying human behavior and decision making. Needed subjects for some simple Q&A sessions. $500 for a few hours of work. Mike figured, what's the worst that could happen? The address they gave him was up in the hills, one of those winding roads where you can't see your neighbors. Mike told me later that when he pulled up to this mansion, and I mean mansion, he almost turned around. The place was massive, all marble and glass, with these perfectly manicured gardens. Way too fancy for some sociology study, but the money was too good to pass up. 2 people answered the door, a man and a woman in their late 30s, both dressed in simple white clothes. Super friendly, almost unnaturally so. They introduced themselves as facilitators and walked Mike through this incredible house. Original artwork on the walls, crystal chandeliers, and furniture that probably cost more than his old salary. They brought him to what they called the interview room. It was completely white. White walls, white furniture, even white carpeting. The only color was the small camera mounted in the corner. The question started simple enough. What's your biggest fear? Describe your ideal day. What would you do if money wasn't an issue? Mike answered honestly, figured that's what they wanted. The whole session lasted maybe an hour, and they handed him 5 crisp $100 bills before he left, and told him they'd like him back the following week for a follow-up session. Mike was pumped. It was the easiest money he'd ever made, and these people seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say. When he went back the second time, though, things got weird. They led him to a different room, and this one painted in this sickly yellow-green color that immediately made him feel woozy. The lighting was different too. There were these panels in the ceiling that would flash in random patterns while they asked the questions. Bright white, then dim, then this pulsing rhythm that made it hard to focus. Mike said the strangest thing was how he found himself answering questions about his beliefs, his values, and his relationships, and he was giving responses that didn't sound like him at all. Like when they asked him about his ex-wife. Instead of the usual bitterness, he heard himself saying maybe the divorce was part of a larger plan. When they asked about his career, he said he was ready to let go of conventional success. After that session, they introduced him to what they called a proxy. He was the soft-spoken guy named David, who wanted to talk about Mike's spiritual journey. David had this way of making everything sound profound, talking about how society conditions us to want the wrong things, how true fulfillment comes from surrendering individual desires for collective consciousness. Mike found himself nodding along, agreeing with ideas that normally would have made him roll his eyes. Before he knew it, they were inviting him to stay at the mansion for an intensive program. All meals included, private room, and they'd pay him $1,000 a week just for participating in daily sessions. Mike's lease was up anyway, and he had nowhere else to go, so he figured why not. Those 3 weeks are still fuzzy for Mike. Every morning started with the light room. They called it calibration. The flashing got more intense, the questions more personal. They'd ask him to describe memories from childhood. Then somehow those memories would change in his head while he was talking about them, like they were being rewritten. Afternoons were group sessions with other residents. There were maybe a dozen people there, all around Mike's age, all with similar stories, recent divorces, job losses, and financial problems. They'd sit in a circle and talk about releasing attachment and embracing the collective. Mike said everyone spoke in this weird monotone way, like they were reading from a script they'd memorized. Mike said the rituals were the worst part. Every evening they'd gather in this basement room lined with mirrors. Everyone wore white robes and would chant these phrases in some language Mike didn't recognize while staring at their reflections. The chanting would go on for hours until people started swaying, some of them even collapsing. Mike said he remembers participating, but it felt like he was watching himself from outside his body. What finally snapped him out of it was seeing a familiar face in the white room during his 4th week. We'll call him Tom. We went to high school together, and I guess Mike recognized him, even in that brainwashed state. Something about seeing Tom, this guy he'd known before all this started, broke through whatever they'd done to his head. Mike managed to somehow hide in Tom's car while Tom was doing his first session. When Tom came out, he was already talking differently, using phrases like expanding consciousness and transcending limitation. During the drive down the hill, Mike had Tom pull over. It took 20 minutes of Mike explaining to Tom what was really going on before it finally sunk in for him. Tom said it was like waking up from a dream. Suddenly it all made sense and he realized what was going on. They went straight to the police. Mike gave them everything: the address, descriptions of the people, details about the light rooms and the basement rituals. The cops took it seriously enough to send a unit up there the next day. By then, the mansion was completely empty. I'm talking stripped clean. No furniture, no equipment, no sign anyone had ever lived there. Even the mirrors in the basement were gone. The property records showed it had been sold 3 days earlier to a shell company that didn't exist. Mike's been in therapy ever since, trying to piece together what really happened during those weeks. The therapist says it sounds like systematic psychological manipulation, probably drug-assisted given how fuzzy his memories are. But the scariest part is, Mike still gets emails sometimes from different addresses with similar offers. Things saying stuff like, "Want more out of life?" and seeking individuals ready for transformation. He deletes them all now, but sometimes he tells me he wonders how many other people are up there in houses like that, staring into flashing lights and forgetting who they used to be. I check on Mike every few days now, just to make sure he's still him. You have been watching Noir, a Radeon production brought to you by Spoopy Cola.